Okay, well, let us get started. This is a new initiative of Illuminations. We're calling it Illuminaries, and our goal is to feature faculty and instructors at UCI who are writing books that are making an impact on culture and the arts. And today we're really happy to have both Inez Tan and Amanda Hall here. Inez has her MFA from UCI, and she is a very devoted instructor and program coordinator for our creative writing students. And she's the author of a book that she's going to be talking about today. And Amanda Hall is one of our fantastic undergraduates, and she's a co-editor of UCI's New Forum, which is a literary magazine. And so Inez and Amanda are going to talk about writing at UCI, about Inez's projects, about creating a community of writers, especially right now with new constraints, but also new tools. So if you have questions, you may use either the chat or the Q&A function throughout our meeting. And we will have some time towards the end for a Q&A discussion that Inez and Amanda will be hosting with you. So let's give a virtual round of applause and welcome to the amazing Inez and Amanda. And I'm going to turn it over to them now.
Thank you so much, Julia. Just to briefly introduce New Forum and Amanda before we jump on in. And we're delighted to be with all of you here virtually. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. New Forum is an undergraduate creative writing journal, actually one of the longest concurrently running journals in the nation. They aim to highlight the unique talents of UCI's student community through the power of poetry, prose, and art. New Forum also encourages student engagement and creativity by hosting quarterly workshops and open mics, as you'll hear about more at the end of today, and how you can contribute to New Forum's very next upcoming issue. Amanda Hall is a 21-year-old poet and musician. She enjoys astrology, ubi ice cream, rose milk tea, getting bullied by her friends, beautiful people with deep voices, and playing guitar until her fingers hurt. She will be completing an English major and a creative writing minor, and she's working right now with New Forum as co-editor-in-chief alongside Sierra Meyer. 5 of her pieces have been published in 2 different journals. She can also be found on Instagram, and we will tell you more about that afterwards. Over to you, Amanda.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone who made this event happen. Obviously, all of the editors I work with at New Forum as well. Sierra, my co-editor-in-chief, and everyone who has submitted so far to our winter journal. Obviously, after me and Inez finish asking each other questions and sort of reading some stuff off, we'll tell you more about how all undergraduates can contribute to our journal. But as of right now, just to clarify things super quickly, we do have a winter 2021 journal, and submissions for that, I believe they close on Sunday, February 7th, and the cutoff is 11:59 p.m. So just in case you guys want to continue to contribute, we take art, photography, poetry, prose, pretty much anything that can kind of like help you express your creativity. But yeah, that being said, I'm really grateful that we had the chance to connect with all of you at this event, and that me and Inez can talk about writing today, because I think that's something that's really fun, and that's something that I've definitely missed now that like everything is remote. Like I've kind of just had to keep all these thoughts inside my brain until like we could actually organize events to focus on these things. So I really appreciate it. Yeah. I think that being said, and as I think we wanted to start off with questions, and then we were going to do like pieces, right?
Yeah, so I think Amanda's going to ask me a couple questions. I will do my best to answer. I'll read an excerpt from the book that I'll be talking about today, which is my debut collection titled This Is Where I Won't Be Alone. And then I'll ask Amanda some questions about New Forum and undergraduate creative writing experiences here at UCI. Amanda will get a chance to read some of her work, and then we'll be glad to take questions from the audience. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A at any point. We'll get to them at the end. We'll see them all as they're coming on in, but we'd be happy to answer just about anything. So that's what we're going to do today. Take it away, Amanda.
Yeah. So I made some notes on my questions for you. So one of the first things I wanted to ask is I was going to talk about your anthology. So I wanted to ask you if there was a story that resonates with you most, and on that note, like if there's anything you wrote about that are actually based on your personal experiences, because I know that's something a lot of writers will tend to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think the story that has been resonating with the most with me, even after the book has been published, is the first story. It took me the longest to write. It took me about 7 years. It spanned pretty much the length of the whole book. It was one of the earliest stories that I started, and it took me so long to kind of get to the right ending for it. It's titled Edison and Curie. It's about two twins who are growing up in Singapore. They're about 16 or 17 years old, so they're kind of in the equivalent of like high school, kind of junior, like about to go to the university years. And it's a really critical time in the school system. There's a lot of pressure to do extremely well on exams. And it's a real kind of pressure cooker of a time. And Edison is sort of the genius twin. And Curie is not doing so well with school. She's kind of finding that the older they get, the more they're sort of starting to diverge. And that's hard on her as not only the twin of a genius, but someone who's just not doing well in school right now. I think it resonates with me the most because I put so much of my own experiences into it. I mean, the story is original and was kind of an exploration, I think, in a way of my own kind of struggles with school at the time, but by way of fictional characters. Thinking I thought about Einstein's twin experiments a lot, and how when he wanted to run a thought experiment that he couldn't do in reality, he would say, what if there were twins and one of them did this and the other one did this?
Mm-hmm.
And so it became a way for me to imagine, what if there was someone who was excelling in school and then somebody else who was kind of falling off the map, which was kind of what was happening to me. What would it be like? What would they be thinking and feeling? And what would be, I think most importantly, kind of a good landing place for the two of them? I knew I didn't want it to have a completely happy ending. A lot happens to the two of them throughout the course of the story. But one reason why it took so long to get to the end, I think, was I wanted a landing place for them, somewhere that seemed the right place for them to be in the end. So that's one I'll be reading from and that I think about the most. I don't tend to write incredibly autobiographically, but there is one story in there called Oyster, which is about a mother-daughter relationship, and it's based on a true thing that happened to me. My mom gave me a bag of dried oysters. I utterly neglected to do anything with them. They all went moldy, and I threw them away. And I thought, I have to write a story about this, what I've done with the symbol of my mother's love for me. And I tried to write it, and it was incredibly boring. It was sad. It was pathetic. Until I thought, what if I wrote about this from the perspective of one of those oysters? And so that alone of all the stories is the most autobiographical, but I think being able to narrate it from a slightly different perspective was kind of what turned it into an imaginative story and not just an anecdote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's actually really interesting too, because I think like when I was originally drafting these questions out, I was actually going to ask you about the twins. And I think it's interesting that that came up. I think that's like also really interesting because I was going to ask if that was almost a metaphor, because I know when people talk about twins, you can either like there's a really special bond they have that people don't seem to understand. It can like either go one way or another. Like they can be really close or they can hate each other if they're super different. I think that like one way I've kind of seen people perceive that too is that they'll say that like sometimes if you're talking about twins, it's almost like they're two halves of one whole, and like one of them can almost be like a shadow. So I think like that, and the fact that you're saying that like the oyster story, which was like personally the story that was my favorite from your anthology. I think it's interesting how you said, you kind of took these personal experiences and you included it, and it almost seemed like it highlighted I guess like the way that you felt about it in like a metaphorical way. And I think that's really interesting how like us as writers will kind of like fixate on something that doesn't really seem like a big deal, but when you kind of write it down, it really illuminates how you actually feel about it and like the other things it can represent. So I think that's really interesting. Um, but yeah, I'm gonna go through my other questions I have for you. Um, so I am going to ask you this one. I think one thing that really stuck with me um, while reading your anthology is the overarching theme of family. And I was wondering if there are any other recurring themes that you notice in your own writing, and if you include them on purpose or if it's accidental.
Yeah, that's a great one. And actually, that goes to pretty much how I ended up shaping the whole book. I started this book, well, I started some of these stories when I was in college, and I was at grad school doing my MFA at the University of Michigan when I had to, time to write a thesis, like put a book together of some kind. And I just thought, well, I have all these stories and they have nothing in common. All I've tried to do is just write one story after the next. But it occurred to me, okay, maybe the setting is something that they have in common. A lot of these stories are set in Singapore, where I grew up from age 7 through 15. There's lots of great story collections that are centered around a single place. And I thought, okay, thankfully, something. But what I realized when I started, putting the stories together, it's not just that they were all set in the same location. I think what I was really getting at was the sense of belonging. What I was interested in exploring was the feeling of belonging to a place, especially for Singapore as a country that changes so quickly. Things are always under renovation. Innovation is always happening. Places are changing. This idea that can you have a sense of belonging to a place that changes so fast? And if that's not where you're getting your sense of belonging, what is your sense of belonging to? So as I was thinking about all that, I was trying to think of what to title the collection. And I really admired a lot of collections where something about the title told you something about the whole book. So I was thinking, what can I title this book of stories that's set in Singapore? And there's a famous song that we sing kind of for National Day every year. It's titled Home, and that's where the title of the book comes from. In the chorus, the lines are, "This is where I won't be alone, for this is where I know it's home." And when I thought about that, I thought, that's it. The stories are thinking about home. They're thinking about a sense of belonging. So even though there's one about a dragon in a fantasy land, there's a story set on the moon in the future. On the outside, they might seem to have not that much in common, but what's linking them is they're always thinking about, who do I belong to? Where do I belong? What is the sense of belonging? And I would say it was something that kind of arose as I was working on the stories and began to notice, oh, this is something that I'm coming back to over and over again.
Yeah. That's definitely really interesting too. And I think that's something I also noticed. And I guess like the fact that it's an anthology, I think it's really interesting how those themes kind of intersect because you can really tell. And the insight you gave us into the title is really helpful as well, because I didn't even think about that. But especially since it's like specific to the setting, that seems like a really like heartfelt title. And it's really fitting for the piece. But yeah, to move on as well a little bit, I wanted to ask you, when you write, um, do you base your work around stories, scenes, or settings first? I know some people, they'll kind of build on dialogues or character descriptions, or like maybe start off with a little bit of word building and kind of go from there. So I wanted to know, like personally, how you kind of get started when you're working on a narrative and how that works for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is that it was different for every story, in part because I was just trying to find out, how can I write my way into something? One way to do that for me was to start from a different place every time. But really what was happening, especially with the early stories, was something that I was learning in my own creative writing courses at Williams, where I was an undergrad student, which I try really hard to bring into my teaching. And the way they sort of phrased it at the time was writing imitations of stories. So we would read lots of stories for class, and we would bring in an imitation, meaning something that was written from the same perspective, something that took place in multiple locations the way the original story did, something that used some formal feature of the original story, but did something else. And for me, starting out as a young writer, that really helped me because I don't think I could ever have sat down and thought, I want to write a story about elitism and competition in the school system. I just could never have done it that way. But somehow I could sit down and say, all right, I've just read this incredible story by Mavis Gallant. It has this amazing sense of humor. It begins by telling us what's going to happen at the end of the story. I'm going to sit down and try and write a couple of pages and see what happens. And so most of these stories actually began really deliberately from the seed of some other story. The story that's set on the moon was based on a story by Wells Tower called On the Show, where he just follows all these people at a fairground kind of over the course of a single day. And I remember waking up at like 6 a.m. because I really wanted to rewrite a story for the class I was taking. I wasn't happy with the stories I'd done so far. And I thought, all right, I need a lot of things to happen in a single location. I want to feature a lot of different people. Where am I going to put it? I'll put it on the moon. And I sort of started from there. And kind of later on began to realize what I was trying to tell in that story. But I think for me, kind of keeping part of my mind busy with, like you might call it a constraint or something you're trying to do or something you're trying to work around actually frees me up, I think, to have kind of creative ideas about the subjects. And to me, I think learning from other writers is one of the best things we can do as writers. I always try to say, like, what you see another writer doing, you can do too. If you saw something exciting, you could try it out in your own work. And I don't think that's like derivative at all. I think that's a way to feed your own writing, to kind of give yourself more tools and to kind of teach yourself what kinds of stories you're interested in telling.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Plus, I think the way it's also been explained to me in the past is that you can't be a good writer without being a good reader too, because like you can't really pick up on the things that you're interested in until you kind of see it set out in front of you in a different way. But yeah, so I'm going to ask you one last question just to make sure that you have enough time to read too. Um, so the last question I wanted to ask you was about genre. So I wanted to ask if there are any literary genres you're particularly interested in, and if you personally identify yourself with any type of genre, or if you feel like your work defies genre itself.
Thanks. That is a great question.
Mhm.
I really would say that I started in science fiction, which I think is maybe could be surprising because when you look at the book, most of the stories are, kind of quote unquote realism set in, kind of real recognizable circumstances. But it was such this great moment when I was in like, I guess, middle school, and I was at a school where the bookshelves were organized by genre. And I took down one science fiction book, not knowing what it was, and thought, oh my goodness, I need to read every book like this. And so I read a ton of science fiction. And I think what I loved about it so much was that it was such a great way to ask what if. I think all fiction does this to some degree, but science fiction especially. What if I invent an entire world as a way to explore what I feel, what's going on in my time, what would happen if this happened to the world I was in. So I really think about science fiction when I'm writing. There are a couple of stories that have some science fiction elements. And a phrase that I encountered recently is by the fabulous fantasy writer Ursula K. Le Guin. And she was trying to talk about, why is it that we classify writing into genres? Why is there such a tension between sometimes quote unquote genre fiction and realist fiction, as though one had to be better than the other, as if one of them was real literature and the other one was kids literature or YA literature or something else. As soon as there's like unicorns, we no longer take it seriously. And she had the most incredible phrase that I wish I had known all these years ago. And it's, she described, writers of speculative or fantasy or science fiction as realists of a larger reality, as if there was the sense that we are not bound in our imagination, right? We can imagine all kinds of worlds to tell the stories that we're interested in. Like, why should we be limited to actual circumstances when we're trying to tell a story that explains the reality of something that we know to be true. So I would hope that I could write every genre someday.
Mm.
I really love reading all kinds of genres. And as much as I think this book reflects a rootedness in Singapore to some degree, I really enjoy all these genres and hope that, yeah, I could write in all of them.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like, you know, what she said is really true as well. And it's also reflected in her work. I know
Mhm.
I took a class where we kind of like talked about it probably like a year ago now, but definitely I feel like pretty much every genre does have really similar human aspects. And it's all just about authors kind of trying to find the things that interest them and that speak to their own experiences. So I definitely agree with that. Yeah, that being said, I'm also going to hand the floor back to you just to make sure you have some time to read the excerpt from your book as well that you were wanting to share with us. So
Yeah. Thanks again, Amanda. Thank you for those questions. I feel like we could talk for much longer
yeah,
about all of them.
totally. We
Yeah,
start our own
and
podcast
a
crowdfunding.
series. And I want to ask you more about that class you took last year. But for
Yeah, it
now,
was really cool. It was a pulp fiction class, and like
ooh,
I think it was we went from detective fiction to like classic science fiction. I think it's really interesting how those two intersect and like
mhm,
how you know it's just so interesting to me how literature it all just is basically just like a direct response to I feel
mhm,
like society. It's just what I've noticed from all the different books I've read. So I think that you know especially with your work as well, it's really fitting because it's your personal experiences and your characters' experiences based on their setting. And I think that's really interesting. It really speaks to all your characters and their experiences and like the places that you're talking about. So
no, thanks. I'm really happy to hear that. And I think that sounds great. I think of most fiction, poetry too, but as a kind of imaginative exploration. And sometimes the way you do that is by setting it in a recognized world. And sometimes the way you do that is you invent the world that you need for it.
yeah.
So with that, this is more of the former, I think. Um, this is the first story in my book titled Edison and Curie. I'll read from the beginning, then I'll jump ahead a little bit to the middle, and I hope it'll give you kind of a good sense of the through line of the story. So this is Edison and Curie. Curie-chan was always better known as the twin sister of Edison-chan, the boy who had shown great promise at an early age. At 12 years old, Edison had been the first student to top his cohort with a perfect score of 300 points in the primary school leaving examination. In secondary school, he had garnered 12 A1s on his O levels, won an ASEAN essay competition, delivered a speech on racial harmony before the president, and completed a pioneering internship in biomedical research. Shortly after that, both twins matriculated at Stanford Junior College, widely acknowledged to be the best school in the nation. Stanford students were a specialized elite, trained in the most hostile of environments, striving for excellence in all aspects of life. Hence, several of them knew what to do at 9:30 a.m. on the Monday in November that Edison stood up during a lecture and opened both his wrists with a penknife. In the middle of an auditorium packed with 500 people taking frantic notes on kinematics and projectile motion, he rose to his feet, held his right arm high, palm forward as though eager to ask a question, and then reached up with his left hand and whipped the blade across his wrist. He repeated the gesture with his other hand. It took a moment for the silence to set in, and almost no time for it to be broken. The tutor started screaming like a stuck pig. The head prefect, who was on the judo team, tackled Edison to the ground. A cluster of girls from St. John's First Aid Brigade made a quick, assured circle around him and began tending serenely to his wounds. White-faced, Edison made no effort to resist as they bound his wrists with the judo prefect's navy blazer and elevated them over his head. No one paid any attention to Curie, who was attempting to fight her way through the crowd without much success, yelling, "You were supposed to help me." It had been a few months ago that Curie had to admit to herself that Edison did not look like someone who was effectively managing stress. He had become so thin that you could see the outline of his ribs when he tucked in his shirt. Their mother accepted his explanations that he wasn't hungry, While their father said that one overweight child in the family was enough, he meant Curie. Curie said nothing, as shame and schadenfreude dueled in her heart. Then Edison's behavior became even more neurotic than even she could ignore. He came by her room one Saturday afternoon when their younger sister, who had autism, was out at her school's weekend remedial program. Curie, he said. What? She said. I'm studying. She was. There was a pause. She could hear him rubbing his palms over the front of his pants. Never mind, he said, and wandered off. They had this conversation, compulsive, creepy, several times in the next few weeks. On top of that, there was something very wrong about him taking as long as he did in the toilet. She noticed that before he ran the shower, there would be a long period of quiet. But even when she pressed her ear to the door, she couldn't hear anything. If he had been sobbing or screaming or tearing pieces of paper into very small strips, she wouldn't have minded. But his silence scared her more than she cared to admit. At last, she made up her mind to investigate. One evening, after he'd been in the toilet for over an hour, she knocked urgently on the door. Edison, I need to use the toilet. After a pause, he said, use Mon Pause. I need something inside here, she lied. Girl stuff. You've been in there all day. What are you doing? Hot water stimulates the brain, Edison said unconvincingly. A minute later, he opened the door. He was fully dressed, his hair was wet, and his glasses were fogged up. He hurried past her, carrying a towel bundled up in his arms. He could not have made it clearer that he was concealing something. Finally, one afternoon, when her parents were out and her sister was taking a nap, Curie decided to do the most drastic thing she could think of. 20 minutes after he'd gone into the toilet, she yanked the door open. Edison was sitting on the closed toilet seat with his white Stanford Junior College pants bunched up around his ankles. Curie's first thought was that there were long pink earthworms ironed flat onto his thighs. Then she saw that they were thick, meaty strokes of scar tissue interspersed with bright parallel lines of blood. In one hand, he held a small blue penknife. A roll of tape and a roll of plastic wrap were on the floor. He had already measured out a fresh length of plastic wrap to encircle each thigh. He said, "It's not as bad as it looks." Curie stared. For a few weeks in secondary school, she had joined classmates in drawing dotted lines on their wrists with permanent marker, alongside the words, "cut here," but only as a joke. Once her best friend Annette had rolled down the Stanford monogram on her sock to show her 6 shallow cuts beneath her ankle bone. The sight of them seemed to frighten Annette even more than it did Curie, and she never did anything like that again. But all that was nothing compared to what Curie saw in front of her now. She could have laid a finger in Edison's widest cut, which gaped like a pair of lips. "You shouldn't do this to yourself," she stammered. He placed the penknife face down by the sink. "I'm fine. I'm very careful. It's just something I do." "You need help." "This helps," he said. "How?" asked Curie. "How does this help?" Edison went on as though he hadn't heard her. "If anyone finds out, I'll get into trouble. I'll be fine if no one knows." "Edison, you're not fine." "It would be a mark on my record," he said in the same calm tone. "Promise me you won't tell anyone." "Edison, you're not fine." His expression clouded. He got up, shuffling comically with his pants still around his ankles, and slammed the toilet door as he left. The loud, sudden sound woke their sister, who started to scream, "Curie, Curie, Curie!" Curie had no choice but to leave Edison and rush over to attempt to pacify her. The neighbors had often complained. Later, Curie lay on the floor of her room thinking. Outwardly, Edison did seem fine. At least no one else seemed to have noticed anything. It was true that scholarships were competitive. A less than perfect mental health record would jeopardize his future. Telling on him would amount to sabotage on her part. As sick as it seemed, perhaps the best option was to say nothing. She thought about the penknife instead. She'd recognized it immediately. Some years ago, for a geography project in secondary school, they had been tasked with inventing a country. Besides writing an account of their country's history from its founding to its present, they were required to construct an accurate map with landmarks and natural resources made out of recycled materials glued onto a piece of poster board cut into the country's shape. Like all projects in the curriculum, it called for outrageous expertise, and it was a terrible use of their time, but they had to do it anyway for the marks. In an unusual move for him, Edison had proposed a collaboration. Using his greater knowledge drawn from books on the Roman Empire and the art of war, he designed two complementary city-states that shared a border, Edisonia and Curiopolis. One was coastal, with a strategically located seaport and shipping hub. The other was landlocked, but rich in iron and precious minerals. After a turbulent bellicose past, the two were now mutually interdependent, harmoniously thriving in a symbiotic relationship. Edison claimed that the more keywords they could include, the better. Curie's contribution would be to do most of the craft assembly. She was meticulous and had an eye for beauty, while Edison, for all his dexterity in the science lab, could barely spread margarine on bread. It was a wonderful plan, and Curie had almost said yes. But it was then, for the first time in her life, that she felt a twinge of resentment towards her brother. She didn't like how Edison just assumed he would be better at the cognitive aspects of their project. They had started out on an even footing as children, and although it was becoming more and more apparent that Edison had genius that she didn't, she wasn't ready to acknowledge that yet. So she insisted on doing her own project, even going out of her way to buy her own penknife so she wouldn't have to share hers with him. Hers had a red plastic handle, but they were otherwise identical from the same school bookshop. She spent hours and hours on her project, and when she got it back from her teacher, she saw that she and Edison had received the same marks, Edison scoring higher on content, while hers had excelled in design. It felt nice to be recognized as Edison's equal. It hadn't happened since. On the bed beside her, her sister grunted and whimpered in her sleep. Curie decided not to tell anyone about Edison's cutting. She didn't wish to expose her brother, she thought, nor did she want to end his pain. And from there, we're going to talk about Amanda and New Forum, just to kind of segue that.
Thank you for reading, by the way.
Oh, thanks, Amanda. Such a delight to have you here. I've been so curious about how things have been going this year with New Forum, going fully online. And I wanted to just start off by asking, how did you get involved with New Forum?
So I actually got involved as a transfer student. I think it's really funny because one of the first events I came to here was a New Forum event. I had actually just moved from the Bay Area to here in UCI. I had went to community college for 2 years, and then I started to finish out here the year before this one. So I just remember looking through my emails and I saw that they were having an open mic, and that's kind of how I got introduced with them. And then after I ended up working with them and having a couple of my poems published in their journals last year when I was a participant instead of a team member, I remember I was contacted over the summer and the previous editor-in-chief asked if I'd be interested in working with them, just because I know that it was also a lot harder for them, I think, to well, for everyone to transition at first. And I think that they were still kind of like looking for someone to fill the slot. And over time, the previous editor-in-chief found that it would be best if me and my co-editor-in-chief, Sierra, both shared the role. Sierra tends to know more about prose and fiction. That's kind of what she focuses on. I tend to have more of an emphasis on poetry. And after that, we kind of ended up recruiting a bunch of other people, and our other departments, and everyone's really talented and wonderful to work with. And I'm happy that I've gotten the chance to collaborate with them, just because everyone has something really interesting and fun to bring to the table every time we do anything. So I really appreciate that for sure.
Baller. I had no idea that you were kind of part of New Forum even before you started as a student. Good, you say almost one of the first things that you did at UCI. Amazing. And here you are now co-EIC. What is one of the, not even one, what are some of the favorite things you get to do as co-editor-in-chief this year?
I think one thing that me and Sierra really like doing, we kind of like taking feedback from people when we can kind of apply it in a way that's beneficial to all of us. Like lately, something we've been trying to integrate is we want to do like social gatherings. I know like a lot of people will kind of try to do that sometimes for classes as well, and like study groups, because it really creates a sense of community. So I think that's something that we're really looking forward to. But one thing I actually like is when we kind of go through all of our submissions and we talk about it, just because everyone in New Forum, all of our backgrounds are different, but we're all writers no matter what it is. Like there's poetry, there's prose. Some of us, like, we also do more traditional art, like when it comes to painting or drawing. So I think that since we all have different backgrounds and all of our focuses are so different, it's really cool to see what we can make together, because everyone's going to have a different opinion on something. And it's a lot easier to kind of emphasize the kind of like works we want to include, and to like have everyone give their own take. I think that's what makes our journal so interesting, is when you get like a huge diverse group of people, you'll kind of see what appeals to all of us universally. So.
No, that's terrific. Something I've always been really impressed by is how collaborative you all are in New Forum. You're always together and discussing and choosing the pieces that you want to feature. It sounds like lots of people weigh in differently on different, types of writing. It feels like a real like joint effort among all the staff of New Forum, which is really exciting. You mentioned the word community, and I think that's something kind of on all our minds at the moment. With remote learning, it can be a really isolating time. The thing I hear so often from students, from colleagues, from myself, is that it's an isolating and lonely time. And I wanted to ask about, what community has looked like with New Forum, given that you've transitioned to being an all online publication event organizer bonanza this year. What's it been like to be fully online with New Forum, and how has community looked to you this year?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there are negatives and positives for sure. It is kind of sad not to be meeting up in person, just because the feeling you get is different. Like, it's so funny because I always see tweets online where someone's like, "All right, people whose love language is like touch, how are we doing?" And they're all like, "I'm about to die, but it's okay." But then like I kind of feel like I really enjoy kind of communicating and connecting with people in any way I can. And I feel like one shift I've really noticed as things have been remote, it is really difficult, and it can be hard, kind of being concerned for people you care about, especially, since it's the things are getting so much more intense. But I also feel like what I've noticed, since a lot of us are more reliant on digital communication, it's like sometimes I almost feel more connected than I would have before, just because I know it used to be really hard to reach out to some of my friends, and like some of the people you work with. It can be really hard just because we're so busy. But I feel like since we've also gotten so used to Zoom and so used to like messaging each other, it's almost easier to get in touch with people in some ways, obviously depending on who it is. But I think I mentioned this earlier too with both you and Julia. Even though I am kind of sad we can't meet in person, like we said, it's really interesting for these events to kind of pan out, because sometimes like you'll get people from all over the country, from different parts of like the globe. I know that at our last New Forum open mic, we had, I think, someone from South Korea, someone from India, and then someone from the UK. So that's really interesting. And I think that it's even if it is hard, we're also finding new ways to connect that haven't really been done before. And I think that's definitely something that's going to continue to develop and persevere as the pandemic starts to kind of I guess like as like we start to get a better understanding of it, and cases hopefully start to go down in the near future. I think that's something that's gonna like keep growing and like evolving, and I think that's actually like it's exciting in some ways, even if it can be a challenge.
Evolving is a great word. I kind of half joked last year that like New Forum was going to be an even newer forum than ever before, just because you were trying such new things. And something I've really appreciated and learned from you guys' approach. I was lucky enough to speak at one of your events last fall, and something you guys did was you just had writing together time. You supplied a prompt, and all of us just over Zoom took a couple minutes and wrote something and shared it. And it made me realize, even before in person, I did a lot of literary things, but we weren't always creating together. We were
Mhm.
evaluating, we were, listening, appreciating, but there was so little time to write together. It was a
Mhm.
really special space, and we were, very safely socially distanced.
Mhm.
But it's one of like the brightest spots of last fall for me. That's something I try to bring into my classes now. So that came from you guys, and thank you. I thought it was incredibly innovative, and really warm. It was lovely. It was a lovely evening.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask one more question before we let you read some of your work, and
Okay.
that actually, just to connect them, how has being with the new form this year had an influence on your own writing and the other kinds of art that you make?
I definitely think it's kind of what I said before, that
Mm,
sort of being in dialogue with so many different writers who are really good at their focuses and what they do.
mm,
That's really been helpful for me. And I think that I feel like for the past, like, maybe summer until now, I feel like my personal development, it's really, like, intersected with my growth as a writer.
mm,
I think one thing I had a problem with before I kind of, like, started to get more engaged with writing again is that, um, I tend to be a perfectionist, so I'll, like, hyperfixate if I can't, like, make everyone happy, and then I'll, like, freak myself out, and I'm like, "Oh my god, like, no one likes this, I can't release this, no one can ever read this, do not perceive me right now." But I think that one thing I've been trying to learn is that, as long as you have a support system of people who are willing to work with you and kind of listen to you as you tell them what kind of vision you want for your writing,
mm,
that's pretty much all you can do in the end. Because yeah, like, your writing, maybe not everyone will love it, maybe not everyone will even understand it, but once you kind of, like, get the things there that really count, and you kind of put
mm,
that in there, you can sort of, like, work with the people around you who are willing to support you and understand what you're trying to do, and you can
mm,
kind of make it the best you possibly can for yourself. Because I think one thing too is that there's so much, like, ego that goes into writing,
mm,
even though, like, a lot of us tend to be really introspective, like, and it's not about us necessarily.
mm,
I know that, like, the persona we can have as a speaker, it can really, the lines can become really blurred between who we are and, like, who our characters are. Because when you sort of write, it's always going to be something that interests you or affects you, so of course there's going to be, like, a part of you in there. And
mm,
I definitely think that that's something we can all work on, is just to be more forgiving towards ourselves
mm,
and to create the best narratives we can, and, like, not a perfect narrative. It's more what represents us best and what represents the things that we care about best. Because if you're compelled to write something, then it's going to have some meaning. Because um otherwise it wouldn't be in your head at all. So
mm.
having faith in yourself and having faith in the people that are willing to push you, um is probably, like, one of the most vulnerable but rewarding things you can do as a writer, like, even as a person. So
So good. And just beautiful the way that you're connecting, sharing your work with others, and being a good recipient of that work, right, for one another. I think that's a great thing we can do in community, not only speak, but listen. Boom, let's do it, Amanda. Why don't you read us some of your work?
okay. um Yeah, and then also, like, I'll try to get through everything, because I wanna make sure that, like, we have time for questions. But, like, if you guys are also willing to kind of, like, stay and it goes over a little bit, that's totally fine. Like, if you, Inez, and, like, everyone else is willing to do that. But yeah, I'll make sure to get through all this stuff. Um
Take your time. Here we are.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So the first one, I'm gonna read a couple of poems to start off with, and then I'll kind of, like, see how much time we have from there. So the first poem that I'm going to read, I actually wrote when I was 19, and the second one I think was actually published with New Forum in the winter last year before I got on the team. And it's I think they're two of, like, my favorite poems that I've written. So this first one is called Pray. As a child, I was told to fall to my knees and absolve the bitter sin of my own wretched existence. A bastard child with a ghost of a father, an island girl who prays to a foreigner's god, and I never found religion in tear-stained pleas at night, but the plump of her lips stained red like the blood of Christ, intoxicating as the first taste of church wine. pressed against my teeth, melting on my tongue, like the bread representing our Savior's body. I light a candle for her altar, resting on our nightstand, and whisper her prayer as she answers me, drowning me in faith, granting me heaven, blasphemous rituals of pagan gods. And this poem is called Eulogy. Perhaps certain days deserve funerals, but you can't always be sure because life rolls along so carelessly, a casual undertaker leaving you orphaned in its wake. So when it's hard to breathe, you rattle the cemetery gates and revisit the ghosts, the brother and sister you could not possibly mother to save each of your lives, the hours you spent crying about the last time your mother made you feel safe, the time your father moved across the bay to protect himself from a permanent winter, leaving you to freeze, the prayers that never saved you in church because God descended from heaven to tell the pastor you're unholy. And while you creep among the tombstones, omens grip you like a vice. The last phone call your best friend will ever make before she never talks to you again. The spouse who will inch closer to the edge of the bed every night until they fade into the carpet. And finally, a slow and quiet death where no one will come to claim your body because the grief has swallowed you whole. Then you remember, a chronic 19-year-old navigating the dusty interstate like the protagonist in a Kerouac novel, or perhaps like a tumbleweed in a vast kingdom, occupied by illusions manufactured from dust, Ozymandias, to an empty apartment in an unknown city with quiet neighbors where strangers asked to fuck her in the kitchen before her bed frame was installed. I light a candle for each death, past, present, and future, putting myself to rest at the foot of the altar. And I am well aware of the wraiths howling at the mausoleum door, along with the pungent smell of death, brimstone, and formaldehyde. But the flames burn marigold in the darkness, like the sun I've missed so sorely, and roses resting on the marble steps remind me of springtime or the illuminating glow of another girl's cheeks. Perhaps the air is cold outside, but the stars are bright. I admire their luster while breathing life against my fingertips, in, out, in, out. And suddenly, the red string of fate wrapped around my neck falls to the ground. I rest an olive branch against the cemetery gates and tell the ghosts, tonight is not the night. I think we have like a couple more minutes. So I'm going to read like two really short poems that I kind of noticed were actually in dialogue with each other. And it's funny because I wrote them at two completely separate times. But yeah, after that, we're going to have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm just going to get through these and then we can head towards the Q&A portion. So this poem is called Spring Cleaning. I actually wrote it over the summer. The next one I wrote like this week actually. So I think it's interesting how many things kind of intersect, but yeah. Spring Cleaning. I sun myself beneath fluorescent lights, weathered tile, my own private beach, a kitchen island paradise where virgin skin burned red beneath your touch. There's charred ash beneath the burners, the image of you spreading me easy, butter on a hot knife, and how I'd swallow every crumb, choke on every truth. This stove is dirty again. I'm dirty again. I scrub to the bone, black sludge retreating down the drain. It peels like paint now. I do too. This poem is called Sour Jar. I swallow flavorless wafers from the hand of God and pass salt shakers down the dinner table. It's an exorcism of sorts, a consummation. My mother circling me with sodium to keep demons at bay while I deal with personal temptation. His fingertips, coarse and sticky like vinegar, webbed against mine, my heart flatlined and preserved inside the saccharine sweet of her kitchen's honey jar. I know now that salt always comes at a cost and cuts through everything. The bitterness of dad's tequila, the pucker of citric acid, the sting of open wounds, my fat, wet tears. As we lay golden under California smog, sunburn cloaking her shoulders, blue sky our epitaph, I take this moment and die in it, sands of time flowing from my fingers. I ask her to embalm me, ocean water drying memories like skin.
Those were so great, Amanda.
You.
Love those. So much sadness in the first two, and so much sauciness in the second two.
I know. I think it's so funny that you can tell that I like totally progressed as a writer because when I was 19, I was like, all right, I'm just going to compartmentalize all these emotions. And now I'm choosing violence, like actively. It's fine. Like, I think it's so funny how like you can kind of tell like what writers are really like going through or what they're experiencing when they write things, because it really like can impact your writing. But yeah, thank you so much everyone for letting me read. If you guys are willing to it, we're gonna start the Q&A portion, and me and Inez are really grateful that we got the chance to share with you, especially because like hearing an author read their work is a completely different experience than just reading the actual writing, because you can kind of like get a sense of their tone and how they would want it to be spoken aloud.
So with that, I have our first two questions, Amanda. Take a second to kind of take a deep breath. But I'll start with this one from Xiao Wei. If I want to start writing my own fiction, and I'm going to expand this for my own fiction and poetry for the poets in the audience, do you have some recommendations for writers I can read so I can imitate their style? I'm gonna put in a plug for Writing 30 and Writing 31 here at UCI. That is the beginning introduction to poetry workshop and beginning fiction workshop. And what I think is great about these two classes is that you're reading a really wide range of authors, mostly pretty contemporary, many of them still alive. So it's fiction that's being written today, poetry that's being written today. My hope with the range of those courses is that you find somebody there whose style you like. It might be somebody who writes about things that are very different from you. I found this with Mavis Gallant. We were not writing about the same subjects at all, but there was something about her dialogue and kind of the unspoken humor in a lot of her works that I really enjoyed. So I would say kind of like, see if you can look at a range and then see who you really love. I think anybody you really love is somebody that you can learn a lot from. How about you, Amanda? Who would you recommend?
No, I definitely agree with that. I think that like I'd also recommend if you're like a big reader yourself, I'd recommend like maybe sort of like going back and revisiting what you like. It's really funny because I know over the summer there was this one anthology that I really liked. It's called Kissing the Witch, I think, by Emma Donoghue. She actually wrote the book Room as well. But it's like an anthology of like retellings of fairy tales. And it's like about how women sort of like impact each other. But it's really funny because somebody I was friends with, I was reading it with them, and then because I really liked it, and they were like, "Oh, you know what? Like I could see why you'd like this. It sounds like something you would write." And I'm like, "Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense." So I think like when it comes to like writing, I think identifying yourself and knowing yourself is something that's really helpful, because if you gravitate towards something, it's probably because that's something that would really benefit like your own voice from as well. There's always like something you can kind of like pick out when you read poetry. And I think, and as like even when I had my class with you last winter, that's like something that like I'd get from people. I'd be like, I like this poem, and they'd be like, that's because it sounds like you'd write something like that. And I'm like, you know what? Sure, maybe.
That might have something to do with it. Love it. I think we have time for one more question. I'm so sorry. There's such good ones. I want to make sure we end at around 6, but we will also let you know where you can find us on social media. I think we'd love to answer. So we'll make sure we get back to those, even though we want to end on time. But I think let's take this question from Janice Carpenter, which is a big one, boy. But Janice asked, how has your imagination shifted since the pandemic? Will you be writing toward a different future?
Oh, that's a good question.
It's a great question. I think I would say like almost certainly yes, but it's something that, I mean, it's like the water we're in right now. I think a phrase that I've had for kind of the last 4 years, and that came back to me even more during the pandemic. When I'm reading, I'm always asking, is this saving my life a little? Is this poem saving my life a little? Is this story doing something to save my life? It's a pretty big ask of something that I'm reading, but I'm finding like I want to read literature that gives me something I need to live right now. It can be really small. It can be an ode to an onion. It could be, a scene between two people. But I think more and more searching for what seems life-giving that creates a world that we can be in and inhabit, is something that I'm really looking for in what I'm reading, and hopefully something I'm doing when I'm writing. Amanda, what about you?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's unavoidable to kind of, I guess, like think about the pandemic or write about it in a way, or at least have it impact your writing in some way or another. Because, like, I think we kind of touched on this earlier too, but I definitely feel that art is really special because it has a way of directly interacting with the world around us. And I think that, the more you study literature, the clearer that becomes. Because it definitely like interacts with everything that the author cares about and the world they live in. And I think that if anything, writing in the pandemic has really just like encouraged me to kind of to sort of foster an even deeper like, I guess, introspective view of myself. I think like it's definitely given me some more time to reflect, and it's also been giving me, I feel like it's been encouraging me to experiment, because there are certain things that I'd be afraid to like do before or right before. And I know that some people were saying that like they've been figuring out new things about themselves in the pandemic. And I think part of that is because when you spend so much time with yourself and you aren't going to professional settings in a physical way as often, it really encourages you to sort of dig a little deeper and gain a better understanding of who you are as a person. And that's going to impact your writing positively, even if it can be kind of like frustrating to like trudge through all of that at first, just because it seems overwhelming. But at the end of the day, it definitely can create a positive impact on your writing. So
Well, thank you, Amanda. And here's to listening more to ourselves and more to one another in all that we're going through. What a pleasure to speak with you and to hear so much of what you've been thinking about.
yeah.
That was just amazing. I want to thank both of you. I loved your answers to Janice's question. I thought this whole idea of a poem, how does it save my life a little, Inez, was just extraordinary. And then this opportunity for self-discovery that we've gotten, whether we wanted it or not, in this pandemic, Amanda, is really a profound insight. So